As we always talk about this, you are your own first response. You got to be responsible for your own response right out the gate, because by the time law enforcement, EMS, emergency services show up, it's often too late. They're arriving to pick up the pieces. So what happens when you have to be your first response and then potentially you or all the people around you can't reach 911 because the system is down? Last night, Texas, Nebraska, Nevada, and South Dakota all had outages because of a cyber attack. That's right. If you called 911, nobody responded because you couldn't reach them because you got a busy tone. The entire state of South Dakota was in the dark because of this cyber attack. And it begs the question, what are you supposed to do when your house is on fire? When you have an accident or injury, maybe including yourself? What happens when you are in a catastrophic incident defending your own life and there's nobody to call? What do? We'll talk about that and give you guys some answers, but let's go through the statistics of 911. Take a gander at these stats. In New York City, over 10 million people called 911 each and every year. The average 911 call duration in Washington, D.C., for example, is 122 seconds. In 2019, San Fran received 1.3 million emergency and non-emergency calls. On average, every single day in this country, the U.S. 911 dispatch centers answer 650,000 calls a day. In the United States, an estimated 1,000 lives could be saved annually if 911 response times were reduced by just a minute. What happens if nobody comes because nobody can reach 911? Remember, 911 dispatch centers aren't only for calling 911, but they're most importantly for disseminating information to law enforcement to help prepare and deploy who's needed. I mean, you're not going to send a firefighter to a gunfight. You're not going to send a law enforcement officer to a fire. Also, when officers are arriving, the information that's being reported via Good Samaritans or responsible citizens is smartly distributed, disseminated, and communicated to law enforcement. So what happens when law enforcement are arriving in the blind? What happens when a department that's so politically infiltrated and manipulated has a standard operating procedure or sitting in their patrol cars until the call is made? In fact, not responding to normal calls, basic calls, only responding to the worst calls because they don't have a presence. They're not offensively moving about based on the radical politics of the city they're in. So that proactive side of law enforcement that doesn't exist in major cities because of politics, because of ideology, now that leaves us in a situation and a circumstance where who do you think is going to exploit this? Not foreign adversaries, potentially cyber hackers who are shutting down the infrastructure, but evil people. Criminal elements, gangs, evil people who are going to exploit the advantage they have of operating basically in the dark, in the shadows. If they know you can't call 911, they're going to take advantage of that. And do you have a plan to prepare yourself? Do you have a plan to defend yourself in that worst case scenario? Now let's get to the story. A mass cyber attack is suspected to have caused a 911 outage that hit 4 states across the country. Now here's what I do know. Heather, an intel officer, reports to me. She told me that there are places that weren't reported. So a lot of places went unreported. How does that work out when we have a broken system, a fragile old legacy system that's not able to keep up with the threats of tomorrow or just today or last night? Cities as big as Las Vegas, as well as the entire state of South Dakota, and locations in Texas and Nebraska announced the outages on Wednesday night. Here's what the department said. It has warned of increased cyber attacks on 911 services as they have migrated to digital systems. That's right. Your 911 system is tethered to a digital and vulnerable system. You would think before we put the horse before the cart, you would navigate the cart keeping up with the horse, but we haven't. I mean, we're running on Flintstones while we're being drugged by a Tesla. doesn't make any sense. And yeah, we're sending more money to Ukraine and Israel. That's what we're doing. So back to the story. In an analysis compiled by the agency and published by ABC News just hours before the outages. Let me say that again. ABC reported hours before the outages, they outlined concerns of how emergency services can be exploited for sensitive data. Is that coincidence? I think not. I don't think it is coincidence. I think they were either tipped off or they knew what was going to happen. The bulletin said that the ransomware attacks have disrupted the networks of police department, 911 call centers, and operations. Disrupted is a nice way of putting it. It completely shut it down. Well, that's why you need to take back your self-reliance in all fields. You know, I typically talk about defense and why you need to be prepared to defend your life, but we're not just talking about that. Because you call emergency services for many things. To report a drunk driver driving down the road. Let somebody know that your business is on fire. To let somebody know there's suspicious activity. Now, potentially, none of that is reportable, and you have to be able to manage those circumstances yourself. Think about EMS. Why would you call EMS? For immediate care and transport? Well, you better be able to provide your own immediate care and transport. And the most important element to this is you can't do it alone, which is why we drive home the point of American contingency. You know, AmericanContingency.com by design is built for communities to bridge the gap of not wanting to talk to people, socially interacting, and not doing it interpersonally, building relationships. It's why I started a town hall. I mean, my town hall is basically a micro American contingency, but I don't need technology to communicate to people in my locals because I can put it out the all call and get people to show up. And I did that recently. Now, I can get 30 people to show up because we have a business, we have a marketing apparatus, we have a social media feed. I didn't even push it. 30 people showed up. Now I'm building relationships with those people, talking about issues that are going on in my backyard with the sheriff, with the mayor, with the governor, with policy, with legislation. We're having a potluck. We're building relationships, and then we'll continue to train. It's dating before getting married. I don't want to invite people into my home and be like, hey, welcome to my home. I want to build that relationship. I want to see who shows up. And you could do the same. You can go on American Contingency. You could build a relationship. Hell, you can go to your church. Probably shouldn't say it in that order. Go to your work. You can go to your friend group and say, hey, we should probably start thinking about this. And building, I don't know, build a comms plan. Build a communication plan that actually works, that's analog, where you don't need to depend on digital technology and immersion. That's what we need to do more of, because what I see, it's a very basic pattern where all the elements are being probed. And what is that? It's an ops test. Because if I cyber hack and probe and shut down a fraction of the system, I could look at response times. I could look at composition and disposition of how people are responding, how institutions are reacting. And then I could develop and evolve my plan. And then when the time is critical, I don't know, maybe the night of the election, I could shut down all critical infrastructure at the same time, causing chaos. And how would you react if you couldn't dial 911, if your water wasn't working, if your power went out, if all the emergency institutions in your own backyard, we determined it's 2.5 police officers per 1,000 people, are now dealing with the chaos and calamity, I don't know, of an active scenario, an active pew-pew. And then you have to fend with you, your family, and your community on your own. You better be smart and adaptive and figure it out, or you could do both. You could start preparing, you could start planning, and I don't know, start building relationships with people like you should have did in the first place. It's not hard. This phone hasn't made us more socially interactive. It's made us more disconnected from reality. We need to get back to analog, and we need to get back to basics. Let me continue. Cities as big as Las Vegas, as well as locales in South Dakota and Nebraska, have both announced the outages and have posted administrative numbers as alternatives. Can you imagine that? A digital system tethered to a digital infrastructure now outsourcing a landline number. How's that working out? You better get in line. A bulletin that was released said cyber criminal exploitation of the data stolen during ransomware attacks against the emergency service sector, the ESS, likely poses a persistent criminal threat due to the exposure and availability of victims' personal information. That's the last thing I'm worried about is my information. I'm Googleable, so are you. What I'm worried about is the infrastructure of the emergency services that are deployed using taxpayer dollars. Why don't you use my taxpayer dollars instead of giving billions more to Ukraine and Israel, and instead use that to upgrade and advance the security of our systems that we pay for? Here's what's interesting as well. Authorities said they asked for callers not to test out the phone line when they try and get services back up, amid fears that unreported crimes might be taking place. Well, how do we know if it's working? So if I don't know it's working because you're not reporting that it's working, I need to test it because I'm not going to waste precious time in calling something that doesn't work. And so I don't have the time in an emergency. I'm sorry, emergency services, to work through a Rolodex and check your Twitter feed, because that's how they reported this, via their Twitter feed. The Dundee County Sheriff on their Twitter feed said 911 services within Dundee County and surrounding areas are currently down. Callers will receive a busy signal when dialing 911. The service provider for 911 services in the state of Nebraska are working diligently to restore service. If there's any emergencies, please call the administrative line, which is probably a landline. And you're probably going to get a busy signal because landlines don't work that way. Which is interesting as a statistic in 911, most calls are obviously made from digital cell phones. Can you imagine if the cell phone infrastructure went down, both CDMA and GSM? If both those infrastructures went down at the same time that a cyber attack took place, taking down the infrastructure of digital 911, the ESS, then how would people call 911? They wouldn't, because not even a landline would get through. That's problematic. What are we doing about it? Likely as an institution, nothing. Because the president will go in front of the press and talk about issues overseas, but he won't address the 10,000-pound gorilla in the room. Our country is in harm's way because we're weak, not only as leadership, but as infrastructure. Legacy infrastructure that hasn't been upgraded or updated in decades. I'll report more on this in the underground, where I'm going to do tier 1 content on communications because I think it's really important. Thanks to Heather for tipping me off on this, because the mainstream media isn't really reporting on it. It's a blurb, a blip on the radar. You need to get prepared. Till next time. Peace out, guys.